In this video, I'm going to show you 20 tips for your hi-hats. Let's get started. Tip number 1 is layering. Adding layers is a great way to have more control over the overall sound that you're trying to get by adding in whatever layers that you want to complement that sound, to replace whatever's missing, or just to have it sound a certain way. In this example, I have this hi-hat and it sounds pretty good. But I feel like it's missing a bit of punchiness and a little bit of top end. So I've added this punchy layer and this other hat to give it a bit of shine. And this is how it sounds. Tip number 2, adding a saturator to your hats can really push the energy of the hat and make it feel a lot louder and punchier. Grab my saturator, throw that on the channel, turn up my drive to taste, and then turn down the output roughly the same amount that you bring up the drive to balance out the before and after volume. It sounds punchier, it sounds fuller and more aggressive. Tip number 3 is offsetting layers. So if I go into my MIDI channel here, I can offset one of these layers of hats so that it's just spaced apart a little bit and giving a bit of humanization and a bit of swing to the sound. If I go too far, it starts to sound a little bit awkward, so I want to just be going a few milliseconds, just so it's just barely noticeable. It makes your hat feel a little bit fuller, a little bit longer, and a little bit more interesting. Number 4 is going to be changing the pitch of the hi-hats. This is great for making your hats feel like they fit a little bit better in the track. Even just adjusting 1 or 2 semitones can make the track feel like it sits better in the mix. Open up the layers here and let's just solo the first hat. Addressing the first hat, I just want to change this trance position here. So I click on that and I can move it up or down with the arrow keys. And I actually like it a little bit higher like that because I do have some mid frequencies in this lower hat, so I don't actually need to have so much in that top hat. I can go to the 3rd layer now and drop this one down a few semitones. And just by dropping it only 1 semitone, I just feel like it sounds a little bit better. So what you're listening for is just, while you're changing the pitch, that it feels like it just sits a little bit better, or maybe you're just getting a better sound out of that hi-hat. If you go too far, it starts to sound a little wonky, so I would suggest going 1 or 2 semitones each way, but you can go as far as 4 or 5 usually without it sounding too off. Number 5, adding punchiness and not adding shrillness. So when we push up our hats to be louder and feel fuller, sometimes they get a little bit too ear-piercing and they can hurt the ears listening at a high volume. You want your hats to be punchier. Instead of pushing up anything past about 10,000 hertz, try pushing between 2 to maybe 5,000 or 6,000 hertz, where a lot of that punch actually sits in the hi-hats. So we go into the EQ and we actually push up this area. I can maybe dial back just a little bit so it's not so aggressive. It sounds punchier without actually pushing up the volume of the high end of the hat, so it won't get too shrill. Number 6, adding ride cymbals. I'm just adding a 909 ride to my hi-hat drum rack. I'm going to EQ out the bottom end because I just want that nice high end of the ride. My MIDI will be following the same as the hi-hats. I want them to hit at the same time or just slightly offset, and I want to turn that volume down quite a bit. By adding this ride in, I can actually make the hi-hat feel much more present in the top end, or if I add it in throughout the track, it's going to sound like it's more interesting and increase energy. So let's take a listen. Number 7 is going to be panning your layers. So of course, I've layered my channel already. Let's go in and actually pan those separately. So I have this channel here, the punchy one. I want that in the middle of the mix because it's punchy, it has a lot of energy. I'm going to slightly offset the channel at the bottom here. I'm going to pan the bottom channel to the left 20 and the top channel to the right 20. panned slightly to the left and slightly to the right, it's going to sound wider, but we still have that middle centered hat down the middle of the mix, because you want at least one of your hats to be in the center of your mix and the other two slightly offset to give us that nice stereo image. Tip number 8 is going to be velocity changing. So going into my hi-hats, I can actually change the velocities of each individual hit. If I click on these red dots, I can move them, essentially change the amount of volume that is going to come out when each of these is hit. If you move these just slightly, you can make it sound pretty interesting. I could even go in with the pencil tool by pressing B and just shape these like this. So each hit is just a little bit different, and it's going to make it feel less repetitive, more humanized, more organic, and it's going to make your track more interesting on a subconscious level. You can take this even one step further by using the velocity tool, throw that on the channel, and turn up the randomness to about 10 or 12. And that's going to add even more randomness to the velocity, which is going to make your drums sound more interesting. It's very subtle, even subconscious, but it's going to make your track sound more interesting and the listener won't even know why. Number 9 is going to be adding a vocoder. So you can grab a vocoder, throw that onto your hat channel, and then introduce just a little bit of that wet sound. So if I listen to it, it's very aggressive. I can filter out areas that I want. Maybe I just want the high end. And then I can turn down the dry wet, change the depth and the formants, and also change the release time. This can add a nice tail to the end of your sound. If you want your hat to feel a little bit longer, you can push up the release. If you want it a bit punchier, you can bring down the release. It's a cool way of adding just a little bit of white noise into your hats and make them punch through the mix a little bit better. Number 10 is what I call sidechain grooving. This is a really cool way of adding a little bit of extra swing and groove to your track using sidechain compression. So grab a compressor, throw that onto the hat channel, and we will sidechain from the kick drum. And while the kick is playing, I want it to compress the hat just slightly so that it feels like it's just getting squished down just a little bit as the kick is playing. I'm going to exaggerate it so you can hear more of what's going on, but essentially it's going to push that groove even harder because it feels like that hat is kind of following the kick. Change the release settings. And then I'm going to back this off so it's not so obvious. It just feels like it pulls and pushes just a little bit harder. Number 11 is going to be what I call Autopan Flipping. So if I have the hi-hats here, panned to the left and to the right, I can take that off and I'm going to grab an Autopan, throw that onto the channel, and I'm going to turn this amount up about 40 or 50%, and I can turn the rate down a little bit, and I'm going to grab that Autopan and duplicate that onto another channel. So now I have this Autopanned and this Autopanned. So both channels are being auto-panned, and I'm going to click invert on the second auto-pan. So where it says normal, click invert, and now what's going to happen is the left and the right channels are going to swap. So when the first hat is panning to the left 40 or 50%, the other hat is going to be panning to the right that same amount, and they're going to switch back and forth, and it's going to be a nice smooth motion. So it's going to feel kind of like the hats are just circling around your head, and it's very subtle and adds a nice amount of stereo imaging to the song. I'm going to push this amount up to 100% so you can really hear what's going on, but when you're dialing in this on your own track, I would suggest going between 30 and 50%. Number 12 is fade in and fade outs of your samples. It's something I don't see a lot of people do, is actually pay attention to how they can manipulate the sample just by fading in and fading it out, changing the length of the sample's tail and also how it attacks. So if I have this sample here, I can actually fade in a little bit and make this a lot less aggressive. Just about 10 or 20 milliseconds. It already has barely any punch now. And it's much more of a softer sound. It almost sounds like a shaker. And we can do this on the final hat here. And we can actually shorten out the tail a little bit. So let's grab the end and fade out. So it's a much shorter hat. It's totally changed the way that that hat sounds now. It's a simple trick. Number 13 is grooves and the groove pool. So if you aren't using these already, I highly suggest you use them. So if we look over here in Ableton, we have this little symbol here. And if you've never clicked on it, it opens up the groove pool. You can right click, browse a groove library, and that's going to bring you to a library of these groove pool samples. These can be added onto your MIDI and audio clips to give the clips a little bit of swing and groove right off the bat. So I've grabbed this Logic 8 Swing 65, threw that on to my channel, and let's listen to how much it's actually changed it. It's totally changed the placement of the hat. I can actually click on this commit button and it's going to show me what it's doing to the channel. It's moving that hat over quite a lot. So what I want to do is just reduce that timing so that it's a lot less, or use one of the numbers up here that is a lot less. But now when I click commit, you'll see them only move just slightly. And it just adds a little bit of movement to these sounds. So if I put in the grid here, we can see that it's just slightly moved over the hats. Number 14 is reverb buildups. So a really quick and easy way to add a little bit of a transition or a tiny bit of tension and release is to throw reverb onto your hats, or your other drums for that matter, and automate the dry wet with a long decay time. I'll push the decay time up. This is on my hat channel, and the dry wet I'll bring down to 0%, show automation, and as this is building up, I will just draw in that up to, we can even go close to 100%. Number 15 is duplicating your layer and changing it so that you have more variation. I'm going to grab one of the hats here. I'm going to duplicate that hat, rename it to something, and on this second hat, I'm going to just slightly change it. Maybe I will change the fade in just a little bit, very, very subtly. Maybe I can change the pitch a little bit, maybe the volume just very, very slightly, and maybe even the panning slightly. Now what I can do is change this from the E to something else that's not being used, go into my MIDI clip, and I will put some of these notes on the new, slightly different sounding layer than the original one. Now that I have the loop playing, it will play the original hat, and sometimes it will play the second hat that's just slightly different, and it'll sound more humanized. Number 16, ghost notes. Ghost notes are these little tiny hits that are going to be playing that are much quieter, and they add just a little bit of swing and variation into your loop. I'm going to add 16th notes in and around some of the hits here. And I'm going to turn those hits down so they're very quiet and in the background. They're very subtle, but they're in the background and adding just a little bit of swing. Number 17 is adding some light compression. So I'm going to be using a glue compressor for this. You can use a regular one. I'm going to push the attack up to the 3 here, and I'm going to bring down the threshold. I like to go for about 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction, but for this example, I'm going to push it a little harder so you can really hear what's going on. To be honest, it kind of just takes away the punch by compressing this much, but you can hear that it is pulling up some of the quieter parts as well, and that's what I'm trying to get. Those quieter parts pulled up so it feels more loud and compressed, but compressing too hard, you don't want to sound like this, because this sounds pretty compressed and you're losing that punchiness. So just 2 or 3 decibels should be good, but of course every track is different. Number 18, mid-side EQ. So if you want your sounds to sound a little bit wider, you can actually push up the sides of the image by using a mid-side EQ. So if we go to EQ 8, throw that on after the reverb, and I can turn this into mid-side mode, change this from mid to side, and just gently push up that high end. If I push it up really high, you can really hear. But if I push it up just slightly, we're just getting a little bit more of the spread signal in the mix. We can also reduce some of the mids for more contrast. It's subtle, but it does add just a little bit of sparkle in the high end. Number 19, rolling off to make room for other instruments. So as I just said, pushing up the high end to get a little bit of sparkle and shine is great, but if you want to add in some other instruments such as the rides, then you might want to leave just a little bit of open space in the top end frequencies of your mix, say 17 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz. You might want to roll off just slightly to give room to the shakers and to the rides. The final tip, number 20, is adding pre-delay to your reverbs. This is huge. You're going to be giving a little bit of space for your drums to punch through before your reverb actually comes in. So if I use a reverb on my hat channel here, and I put 50% dry wet, we're gonna hear the hat and the reverb pretty easily. I'm just gonna solo the punchy hat so we can hear exactly what's going on. I'm gonna put 50% dry wet, you're gonna be able to hear the hat and then the reverb, and the more I push the pre-delay up, there's gonna be a gap between the hat and the beginning of the reverb. The further the gap, the more space between the beginning of the hat and the beginning of the reverb. So by giving yourself 30 to 100 milliseconds of pre-delay, you're allowing that hat to punch through fully dry before the reverb tail starts to come in. This is a great way to add just a little bit more room to your drums and allow them to punch through the mix without reverb kind of squishing them and pulling them down and making them muddy. If you want to learn more about mixing and production, check out one of the videos right here. If you want the project files, click in the link in the description below and make sure to subscribe over in the corner.